Hello all. And this video is going to now be covering the ethics portion, since we've been discussing language and metaphysics, as well as the aftermath of logical positivism in its criteria of meaning. And if we were going to pick up then on ethics and ethics after positivism, then we would go back towards what Ayer had followed through on his look at theological language and its meaning. And of course, he puts forth that we are emoting our ethics, and that there's actually, takes it the step further to say that there's no actual meaning with regards to moral judgments. We only have these emotive expressions, and so not even statements of affairs in that Bertrand sort of look. We instead have these psychological states, and so, such as murder being wrong, this is an emotion, but there's no actual empiricism behind these judgments. But if we're going to look at what G.E. Moore, in his discussion of the intuition of good, you of course get that echo of that there's the recognition cannot just be reduced down to properties of utilitarianism, of pleasure, or defined in this empirical meaning sense, or at least in a sort of scientifically observable way. And so Ayer, of course, counters intuitivism, that without a description of good, then these statements are nonetheless meaningless. And so, to put forward after Ayer, ethics then needs to look for the meaning of ethical language. And so this video is going to look at all the different ways after positivism how meaning can still come about, and we can make these moral judgments, and to restore intuitivism in the sort of Kantian ethic, if you will. And so our first thinker, W.D. Ross, he uses the intuitive of the right as separate from the good. He's building a dichotomy here of a separation of Mill's ethics of the good ends or pursuits, in that utilitarian aspect of the greater good for the greatest amount of people, and the consequences, if you will, to come through that. But of course, the right is interested in the quality of the act itself and the qualities of the character, I would go as far. And so instead of just the consequentialism, it's actually the quality of the act, the moral duty in that Kantian aspect of ethics. And so Ross argues, in intuitive of right, the term becomes clear despite not being reduced to these natural properties, but recognized within moral promises. And so obligations and the fulfillment of them in that sort of contract, which of course is going to be highly important to pick up on later with Rawls. You can see then that there's a sort of Kantian streak here of following through with your intuitiveness of moral obligation because of the properties of promise and the fulfillment of that promise. And so, if we turn to William Frankliner, he has a book called Simply Ethics, where if you have certain premises coming out into the sort of theological thinking in the question of can you get an ought from an is, which is, of course, is a moral conundrum. And so A doesn't simply logically deduce and imply B, but A plus B does imply AB on the basis of a presupposition, if you will. And so the basis of values with these premises, you can deduce a moral obligation out of that. And so if God in the personal moral being exists, then you have these value judgments for any proposition or premise put forth to you in an ethical way of thinking. And so what he's asking for or advocating is a moral point of view, which under Ayer and the empirical verifiability of cognitive statements, this isn't a cognitive ingredient to put forth with regards to something like faith to presuppose. And so this doesn't also follow under the criteria of emotion either, or an attitude. And so that's how he notices the shortfall of positivism and its ethical arguments. And so our next one with M Hare, he takes an imperative rather than an indicative. Language isn't a factual statement of A is B or stealing is wrong. It's the imperative is prescribing and not in a description sense. And so this, of course, evades the positivists of moral assertion then, because positivists didn't really look at things like commands and how only description was really allowed within positivist thinking. Description and expression. This is too narrow, and as Wittgenstein even famously says, thou shalt not, and what if you do, or what if I do? And so you can't actually see what thou shalt not statement that isn't verifiable, and so he plays with that there. So that's kind of interesting to see how it's pointed out that positivist ethics is it's too narrow in its criteria for something like a command. But if we're going to look at an interesting insight into prescriptivism and descriptivism, then we would look at John Searle's value-laden empirical facts, and he asks this in a piece on how would one derive an ought from an is. And so he focuses on the promise to pay a debt, to pay Bongo $5, empirically verified by promising that I was going to be paid $5. This places someone in an obligation in the definition of those terms. And so whoever, let's say you owed me $5, you're under an obligation, and as a translation then results in you ought to pay Bongo $5. And so some factual situations, such as promises of a social action in empirical terms, describes a moral ought and is from an ought, as it were. And so Searle calls this the speech act. By promising to pay me $5, this is a speech act committing oneself to this moral obligation. And one of the interesting ethical ideas to come forth during this time period is the divine command theory. So the divine command theory really is looking at that classic, Platonic discussion of the divine and or the parent, the authority, if you will, and raising the question of, is the command the right because of God's will, or does God will it because it is right? And so, divine command theory really, builds off of that discussion of moral obligation and the commands of God as meaning in these ethical terms. So divine command theory, God's will then puts forth as to why one should be good as a basis for their moral obligation. So how do we know what is right? Because God says so. And so you have a command put forth, a commander, if you will, to put into those ideals. And that's how you can empirically verify by recognizing who the order giver is. And so, general and special revelation in moral knowledge is witness to moral law and how human nature is constructed in his command. And of course, the third way command theory puts forth is to use the meaning of moral terms. What does it mean to say what is right and wrong? Is of course if it's in its reference to God's will. And the next thinker I want to focus on in modern moral philosophy, an essay by Anscombe, which is a scathing critique of the elimination of the concept of law from ethics during this period of utilitarianism and positivism. And so Anscombe says that without a moral giver, you cannot sustain moral law. And without taking seriously the Western tradition of Christian values and Roman Stoicism as well, I believe, argues really on the emphasis of Thomistic natural moral law as the basis for obligation and for meaningfulness of the conception of moral law. And so you can combine then, as Anscombe does, with this divine command theory with the natural law of our knowledge of it, by giving meaning and an authority to natural law in our knowledge of God's will and moral obligation. And so, unless there is a giver, there is no reference point or factual reference to moral law then. Laws can be unilaterally applied between other human beings, such as in this secular society we find ourselves in today. But this is not a divine law in the apprehension of universal, unchanging principles, and as such, we don't have really a distinct meaning towards universals. In fact, we're in a time where that is frowned upon. And so, again, really the synthesis there of natural law and our knowledge and the commands of the divine, you can see plainly there. And if we're going to move on to more contemporary and influential ethicists, then, of course, famously, John Rawls at Harvard, or used to be at Harvard, comes to mind with the theory of justice. So Rawls, of course, builds off of Locke's natural the natural state of nature and the common good and the need for government and the state dependent on a social contract. Rawls enhances this further, though, and says this isn't a state theory, but actually these contracts can be applied not just for government, but for all of morality in an ethical standpoint. And so, famously, of course, he goes to the equivalent of the veil of ignorance. And so, if a group of people adopt a stance or an ethical approach, they, of course, cannot empirically comprehend what future outcomes, future utilities could be depending on a social contract. So what sort of principles do you set forth, despite this veil of ignorance? And so he takes a cost-benefit analysis and wants to distribute equity with advantage, of course, towards the least advantaged, with benefit favoring them. And so he isn't exactly a utilitarian insofar of the maximum benefit with a social safety net, but it's more in that sort of Kantian tradition of the obligation towards the less advantaged. And so the contractarian obviously says that morality doesn't appeal in that sort of a priori intuitive sense or principle, and neither is it consequentially in an empirical notion, or with regards to divine theory, it actually relies on the given social agreement. So Rawls is kind of hard to pin down in that in his theory of justice, because he goes a different approach to all of these other ethicists at the time. And so our next thinker just goes about it in a far different way. If we were going to look at his political ethicists, of course, Rawls going for the common good, moral obligation to the less advantaged, with Nozick, or Robert Nozick, in the Anarchy, the State, and Utopia, he deduces down to one principle, that each individual has the right to acquire, acquisition, whatever he can without breaking any sort of laws. And so he comes from the standpoint of ethics as an acquisitional right that advocates, of course, for consequential, safety net for the disadvantaged. This really makes me think of especially with regards to my when I was in my youth, the sort of Reaganomics, the neoconservative platform. You can definitely see that with Nozick, and Rawls, of course, maybe more towards the left-leaning on these ethical, political questions. And so, also, as you might notice with Western philosophy, there's also a sort of neo-Kantian movement going on in the background with ethicists or even metaphysics. And so, in the background, there's a Kantian approach to ethics through respect for persons to treat people as ends, as the imperative would have put it. And so the maximum freedom for a life project, then, if I want to be consistent, I should respect the same, according to Nozick, and the same freedom of that end. And he calls this the principle of generic consistency, which is taking the Kantian universality principle to assert your own goals and goods in violation of others isn't consistent, though. To get in the way of other people's attainment of ends wouldn't be very consistent. And our next thinker, moving along, Alan Donegan, in his theory of morality, takes a more theological answering in inferring from the principles of Kantian ethics and the universals towards Christian ethicism, and takes to it that it is true. And so, as you can see, there's all of these different ethicists really to come out of positivism and the so-called elimination of meaning in moral judgments, in aesthetics even, and as we can see, ethicism continued far beyond Ayer, and this video attempted to look at some of the different disputes and thinkers in this time period. But before his own standalone video, I did want to give a couple of words. Alistair McIntyre, who will be interesting to put on this channel because he has quite the influence, I think it's fair to say, with my own personal stuff that I post on this channel. And so I want to look at McIntyre and virtue ethics in a more comprehensive way than this video does, with an assortment of different thinkers. And so I look forward to presenting that to you guys. And so McIntyre, to be brief though for this video, wants to turn from looking at the rules and government and its action and its mode of action and decision making, towards something like utilitarianism, and actually towards an ethics of embodying character and the actual qualities and ideas of those characters, such as courage, virtue, friendship comes to mind as well, as we see with some of his interesting dichotomies he'll put forth of these different traditions, these 3 different traditions that he has for ethical history, really, I would say. And I look forward to presenting that video next. This one's gone on long enough. I'm trying to not to hit the 30-minute mark every video. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this one, and I will see you for Alistair McIntyre's virtue ethics.